What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Dragonknight healer. Now the Dragonknight healer is commonly regarded to be one of the weakest classes, if not the weakest class when it comes to healing ability. That's main there for two primary reasons. The first reason is it doesn't provide as much utility compared to the Templar or the Warden healer. And the second reason is it lacks a strong burst heal. The Nightblades are also kind of lumped in here because they don't lack a burst heal. However, Nightblades have a lot more class abilities that provide additional healing. So Nightblades are generally above Dragonites when it comes to healing capabilities. It's not impossible to get into a guild as a Dragonknight healer for vet content like vet DLC dungeons, vet trials, but you're definitely going to need to do a lot more work convincing the raid lead to let you bring a Dragonknight healer as opposed to, for example, a Templar or a Warden healer. That's just because Templars and Wardens have better tools in their toolkits to provide greater group utility. They have greater burst heals, and just keep that in mind if you do want to build a Dragonknight healer and you do want to do, vet trials content. It is possible to do so, but you're going to have quite an uphill battle in order to get there. Just like our other build videos, we'll be going over our gear, our skills, our CP point distributions. We're talking about race, attributes, things like that. And instead of a DPS parse, because healers obviously don't have a rotation, instead we'll be going over what you should be prioritizing and how you should be playing your Dragonknight healer. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with our gear. So you have several possible combinations of gear. The one set that you're always going to have no matter what is going to be Spell Power Gear. This comes from White Gold Tower, so you do need to have the Imperial City DLC in order to get Spell Power Gear, and pretty much all progression guilds, if they're going to be doing vet content, will ask for Spell Power Gear. There are going to be a couple of guilds that will say whatever, we don't care if you don't have Spell Power Gear, but most guilds that want to do progression, in Halls of Fabrication or Maw of Lurkage, or even the hard mode Craglorn trials, they want Spell Power Gear because that 5-piece effect is just the most powerful buff that you can give to your DPS right now. It stacks with all other weapon and spell damage boosts, so it's very, very, very powerful. So pretty much you're going to want to get Spell Power Cure if you want to do endgame content as a healer. It's not absolutely necessary, but for all intents and purposes, you must have Spell Power Cure. For our second 5-piece, so we're going with Mending here for this particular build, but you do have several options here. So let me pull up Inventory Insight. So Mending is one option that you can go with. Whenever you use an area effect heal ability, it basically reduces, it's not a very good metric, but basically reduces damage that bosses deal as long as they're within 10 meters of you for 3 seconds. So Mending is really nice for that damage mitigation, and a lot of progression guilds have a healer run Mending for that damage mitigation, but you do have other options for that 5-piece effect. So the other 5-piece set you can potentially wear is going to be Worm Cult. This reduces the cost of magic abilities by 4% for pretty much everybody in the group. This is a pretty nice set to run. Another set to run is going to be Twilight Remedy. It's not quite as common as Worm or Mending. It's mainly because it's only really useful for Magicka DPS because it gives minor force whenever they activate your synergy. The heal is very nice, but you don't really need that additional heal. It's more for the minor force. The problem is Stamina DPS already get minor force from Rearming Traps. This is only really going to be useful for your Magicka DPS, and you can only activate it every 10 seconds. So you will need to have 2 or more sources of synergies in order to get 100% uptime on that minor force, since the synergy cooldown is 20 seconds. So you won't see this being used quite as often, but it is a nice set to keep on hand just in case it becomes more powerful in the future. Another potential set that you might be asked to use is going to be Jorvuld's Guidance. Jorvuld's Guidance comes from Scalecaller Peak, so you need the Dragonbones DLC in order to get it. The 5-piece effect increases the duration of your major and minor buffs, so pretty much all named buffs, and your damage shields that you apply by 40%. So this does affect, for example, the duration of major mending that you get from Igneous Shield, as well as the duration of Igneous Shield itself. It will affect Warhorn, it will affect the major force, as well as the minor toughness boost from Warhorn. So Jorvuld's Guidance is a very, very nice set to use. A lot of progression guilds are actually moving towards Jorvuld's Guidance instead of Worm for the greater major force uptime. I believe I did the math, and I think it's about a 10 to 15% increase on major force uptime if you have an optimal Warhorn rotation. So that is very nice to have if you have access to Jorvuld's Guidance. And a final set that you might be asked to run is going to be Infallible Aether. You will see this more often in progression guilds. The very endgame guilds use this. Mechanically Challenged, I know, uses this, and they use this mainly for the minor vulnerability application. So whenever you do a heavy attack, you basically apply minor vulnerability to the enemy for 10 seconds, which increases their damage taken by 8%. So this is a very nice boost to your group DPS. Now, there are other sources of minor vulnerability, shock enchants, for example, or the Asylum staff, Destruction staff, their proc chance also applies minor vulnerability. So Infallible Aether might not be quite as strong if you have a lot of Asylum staves in group. So that's something you want to keep in mind there. That is an option, particularly if you are running on with a stam heavy raid groups, because they don't have a native source of minor vulnerability. And those are basically all the options you have for this second 5-piece, not for spell power gear. So for our weapons, go over weapons before we go over armor traits. So we're going with the Asylum's Restoration Staff. It can be perfect or imperfect. It's kind of up to you. The perfect staff is only a little bit better. I believe it's only an extra like 3% increase on the set bonus, so it's not absolutely necessary to get that perfect staff. The other option is going to be the Master Staff. I believe I have one somewhere. Yeah, so the other option is going to be the Master's Restoration Staff. That comes from Dragonstar Arena. The Asylum staff comes from Asylum Sanctorium, which is a part of the Clockwork City DLC. So the Master's Restoration Staff is available to everybody. So the Master Restoration Staff basically restores stamina to every target within your healing springs for the first cast. So that's really nice for stamina sustain, really nice for the tank and your stamina DPS. The Asylum staff is more for the sustain. Basically, whenever you cast Blessing of Protection, or in this case Combat Prayer, the cost of your healing abilities is reduced by 30%. So it's really nice to have. So it basically makes your orbs cheaper, it makes your springs cheaper, your next like 2 or 3 casts of springs are cheaper. So it's really nice for that instances where you need to sustain. For your backbar, you can go with any lightning staff. I have a Maelstrom's lightning staff here for additional damage from our light and heavy attacks, but again, you can use any lightning staff whatsoever. It doesn't really matter too much as long as it's a lightning staff. Now for our weapon traits, you have plenty of options when it comes to weapon traits and enchants. So I have Decisive here, so that's just for increased Warhorn uptime, because we're taking advantage of the Dragonknight's improved ultimate generation. But you can go with something like Powered if you want stronger heals. You can go with Defending if you want a little more survivability. You go with Infused if you want a stronger enchant. So it's all going to be dependent on the situation at hand, what your raid lead wants, and what you need in that specific fight. So just be mindful of that. For our enchant here, I have a weakening enchant on my restoration staff. This reduces the boss damage by good margin. It doesn't really translate very well. It's not like a flat decrease for across all damage, so it's going to be variable, but it does reduce damage from my testing anywhere between like 8 to 15%, depending on the boss and the damage, the specific damage source. For enchants on your backbar and traits on your backbar, you're pretty much all the traits that I said for Restoration Staff are good for the Lightning Staff. An additional trait that you might use for the Lightning Staff is going to be Charged. So I would only use Charge if you're using a shock damage enchant though, in order to help apply minor vulnerability. So for our backbar, I'm using a shock damage enchant for the additional uptime on Concussed, which is the minor vulnerability debuff. I have it infused, but again, you can go with any of the traits that I mentioned, so Charged, Decisive, Powered, Defending, those are all perfectly fine traits. You can also go with a weapon damage enchant to give yourself some more spell damage for stronger heals if you'd like. So that's another option too. You can double up on weakenings to make sure that your weakening enchant is up all the time. So you do have options there when it comes to enchants. You can even go with something like Absorb Magicka if you need that extra sustain. So don't feel like you're pigeonholed into using a shock and weakening enchant. I do highly recommend though that at least one of your weapon enchants is a weakening enchant. Now let's go over armor. So one thing I want to touch upon real quick is Spell Power Cure. You're going to want this in all of your armor pieces because you can upgrade these to gold, and that 5-piece bonus is affected by item quality. So you don't want to have purple Spell Power Cure jewelry because that will decrease the buff. It's not too much, it's like 6 or 7, but if you are a true min-maxer, then you want Spell Power Cure to be all on your armor pieces, and to have the second 5-piece be jewelry and 2 armor pieces. So for our armor, we have Divines on our small pieces with a max Magicka enchant, and for our large pieces, we have Infused with Prismatic enchants. We are giving up some Magicka as a result, but we are gaining health and stamina, which is a fair trade-off in my opinion. And for our jewelry enchants, this is going to be variable depending on the specific set that you're running. So for example, Mending gives us Magicka regen, max Magicka, and healing done. But if we take a look at Worm's bonuses, for example, Worm gives us spell damage, max Magicka, and Magicka regen. So that's something that you're going to want to keep in mind here. So we have 2 spell damage enchants and a Magicka regen enchant. And that's because we are also using the Atronach Mundus, so we are getting a little bit more Magicka regen as a result. So we can afford to take out we can basically take 2 spell damage enchants here to give us higher spell damage, which gives us stronger healing done. Now, the general rule of thumb is going to be you want to try to hit as close as you can to 2000 Magicka regen and about 2000 spell damage when you have unbuffed. It's obviously here, I could potentially even swap out this Magicka regen glyph for another spell damage glyph, which would probably bump me up to 2000. So those kind of something that you're going to want to consider. So 2k and 2k is what you want to shoot for. If you're a little bit under, that's perfectly fine. Don't feel like those are hard numbers that you absolutely need to hit. And of course, like I said, it's going to be variable depending on the set pieces that you're wearing and the Mundus stone that you have. So for example, because I have the Atronach stone, I can invest more into spell damage. If I'm going with the Ritual or the Apprentice Mundus stone, I would probably invest more in Magicka regen because I'm not having that additional regen from the Atronach. Alright. So that's all of our gear done. So now let's talk about secondary stuff. So race choice. I am a Breton. Bretons are one of the top 2 races for healing, generally regarded by the endgame community. The other race is going to be Argonians. Bretons have 10% max Magicka. They have some nice boost to spell resistance. Couple that with the Dragonknight's natural spell resistance, and you have a really, really survivable mage healer. So that's one plus to having a Dragonknight healer. And Bretons have a 3% reduction to Magicka cost, so that's really nice to have for sustain. Argonians have max health, max Magicka, I'm not sure of the exact numbers. They also gain 5% healing done, as well as received, so that's why Argonians are also very nice as healers. Whenever you drink a potion as well, you gain additional resources, so that's really, really helpful for your sustain as a Argonian. You can really go with any magically inclined race style. You can go with something like the Altmer if you'd like, or the Dunmer. Just be mindful that you basically are wasting your passive. That the elemental damage passive from both of those races are pretty much going to go to waste on a healer. But if you are going to be using your healer for DPSing, or if you're going to want to quest on it, it might be a good idea to be an Altmer or a Dunmer. It's kind of up to you though. If you want to just be a pure healer, Breton is perfectly fine to go with, as well as Argonians. Those 2 races are also perfectly fine to be DPS as well. For our attribute points, I have 54 into Magicka and 10 into health here. So the magic number that you want to hit for your health is going to be around 18k health. So you can see here I'm just a little bit shy of 18k. So as a healer, obviously you want to be very survivable. So instead of 17k, a lot of people recommend 18k to give yourself a little bit more cushion room compared to DPS. So that's why we have 10 points into health. Now obviously this is going to be variable depending on your race choice. So if you're an Argonian, they have additional max health, so you're not going to necessarily be need to put 10 points into health. You might be able to shift some points into Magicka. Just play around with the attributes a little bit until you get pretty close to that 18k health recommended health threshold. Now for our Mundus Stone, you do have several options here. I'm going with the Atronach here for additional Magicka regen, but you do have several other Mundus Stones that you can choose from. You can go with the Apprentice or the Ritual. The Apprentice gives us max spell damage, increases our spell damage by a good amount, so that increases our healing done. The Ritual is a percentage increase to our healing done, so that's another potential boost. It doesn't affect spell damage though, it's just an increase to healing done. So it's not quite as useful as Apprentice in my opinion, because the Apprentice at the very least is affected by things like major sorcery and minor sorcery, so spell damage and name debuffs, so that's why I feel like Apprentice is a little bit stronger than Ritual. Another potential Mundus that's kind of overlooked is the Thief, which increases our crit chance. This basically just increases the percentage of healing that we do that end up being critical heals, and that basically heals for stronger, so that the Thief does increase the amount that you're able to heal per second. So that is an option as well. Some people will typically go with either the Atronach or the Ritual or the Apprentice. The Thief is kind of an overlooked Mundus stone. Most people don't typically run the Thief. For our food, you have 2 options. So I'm running Witchmother's Potent Brew, and I'm only running this because I have Prismatic enchants on my large pieces. If I don't have Prismatic enchants, then I would not be running Witchmother's Potent Brew. I'm running Witchmothers for the additional regen, as well as the max Magicka and the max health. So this does have lower health and lower Magicka regen than the other option, which is Orzagar's Red Frothgar, but it does give us additional max Magicka, which does boost the strength of our heals. So that's kind of the plus of running Witchmother's Potent Brew. But like I said, you can only really use it if you have Prismatic enchants on your large pieces, because otherwise that loss in health is going to dip you below that 18k recommended amount. The other option is going to be Orzagar's Red Frothgar. So if we drink this real quick, it gives us a little bit more Magicka regen, as well as greater max health. You can see here I'm sitting at 19k max health now, and I'm sitting at almost 2400 Magicka regen, but we lost about 4k Magicka. So that's kind of the trade-off that you're making with Frothgar. You get better sustain and better survivability, but your healers are going to be a little bit weaker compared to using Witchmother's Potent Brew, where you get that additional 4k additional max Magicka, which ends up translating to about an additional 400 or so on our tooltip. But it's closer to about 380 or so. But we do give up some Magicka regen, and we do give up health, so that's up to keep in mind. That's a trade-off that you're going to need to figure out on your own. And now, on to our skills. So there are going to be some flex spots here, so I'll go over the options that you have for your flex spots when we hit those. Dampen, so this is going to be on our Restoration Staff bar, so we have Dampen Magic, this is going to be our shield. Healing Springs, Comet Prayer, these are must-haves for any healer. Igneous Shields, so this, while it does provide a shield and it does stack with Dampen Magic, this is based on health, your max health, so it's not quite as strong as it would be on, for example, a tank. This is not a flex spot, but you can put it on your back bar if you would like. I prefer it on the front bar though, and this is because of the Major Mending buff. So basically gives you Major Mending for 3 seconds. So basically you use Igneous Shield and you use a heal, and I'll go over that towards the end of the video, and then you basically have a stronger heal for those 3 seconds. Energy Orbs, this is a must-have ability for that combustion synergy, which restores resources to your DPS. This is also one of your strongest heals. This is one of the strongest heals in the game. You don't have to put it on the front bar here. You can put it on the back bar. It's kind of up to you where you want to put it. So this is technically a flex spot in that you can move this ability to the back bar instead and put another ability in its place. For our ultimate, we have Replenishing Barrier. This is kind of a flex. You do have one potential ultimate that you can use instead of Replenishing Barrier that I will go over in a little bit, but Replenishing Barrier is generally going to be the stronger ultimate to choose. You can go with the other morph as well if you'd like, which I believe is Reviving Barrier. For our back bar, Hardened Armor, I would not call this a flex spot because the Major Resolve, Major Ward is very important to your survivability. So I would not call this a flex spot at all, just because you want those resistance buffs for your survivability. Igneous Weapons, this is a flex spot here. You don't need to use it. It gives you Major Sorcery and Major Brutality, but you can get these from potions, and your DPS can get these from potions as well. So this is kind of a waste of a spot here. So Igneous Weapons is really here more for 4-man content, less so for 12-man content, so this is a flex spot. Cauterize, this is technically also a flex spot. You can put this, but in the sense that you can put it on your front bar, on your back, or your back bar. It really depends. This is basically going to be your burst heal. So every 5 seconds it heals for about 4.6k. It is very low cost and it lasts for 15 seconds. So you get, I believe, 4 heals out of this. But compared to other burst heals in the game, like Breath of Life or Budding Seed synergy, it's just not as strong compared to those burst heals. So that's kind of why Dragonknights aren't considered to be in the same tier as Templars and Wardens. Because Cauterize is a very bad burst heal. It's also not a very smart burst heal. Basically launches it at anybody close by. You're not necessarily able to control who gets the heal, unlike with Wardens, where you can basically target with your Fungal Growth or your Budding Seed. You can target those. With Breath of Life, as long as you're facing the person, you know you're going to get that heal off. So Cauterize is not quite as strong of ability there. I would be hesitant to call it a flex spot because it is a nice burst heal. You do need a burst heal from time to time, but at the same time there are definitely weaknesses to Cauterize, and there are probably going to be stronger abilities to put in the place of Cauterize. Blockade of Storms, this is not a flex spot. This is for the off balance uptime. And then Elemental Drain, this is also not a flex spot either. But you do have other options for the minor Magicka steal, which I'll go over just in a second here. And then Aggressive Horn, this is a must-have for support. So for our flex options here. One flex option is going to be Deep Breath. This is an AoE interrupt, so for example on the top boss of Helra Citadel, you can use Deep Breath to help interrupt things. It does have a rather small radius of 8 meters, so you do need to be relatively close, but it is a nice ability to have as a Dragonknight healer. Now for the Restoration Staff bar, you do have a couple of abilities here that are going to be situationally useful. So Mutagen is going to be useful for 4-man content because it does apply it only to 2 people, so it's not quite as useful for 12-man content because you have to cast it 6 times to hit everybody compared to 2 times in 4-man content. It is a very nice heal over time. You can use Rapid Regen or Mutagen. Doesn't really matter too much. I prefer Mutagen because of that additional burst heal when somebody falls below 20% health. Rapid Regen is a perfectly fine alternative as well. You would be putting this obviously on your Restoration Staff bar. I would just put it in place of Energy Orb and then move Energy Orb to the back bar here in place of like Igneous Weapons, this flex spot here. Healing Ward is more of a PvP skill, but I have seen it used fairly effectively in PvE as well. This would also be on your front bar here, taking the place of Mutagen. Siphon Spirit is another potential option to put on your Restoration Staff bar. This applies minor life steal and minor Magicka steal for 20 seconds, so it's very, very useful. You get both life steal and Magicka steal in one ability. There is a cast time associated with it though, so just be mindful of that and be careful of when you use it as a result. Let's see here, your other options for flex. Circle of Protection is one potential ability that you might be asked to use. Let me just get Intimidating Presence. This is going to be useful for execute phases on certain boss fights. A classic example would be Aetherian Archive against the mage. During the execute phase, you're all pretty much stacked on top of the mage and you're constantly taking damage. So having Ring of Protection down gives everybody, you and 5 other people, minor protection, which reduces the damage taken by 8%. So that's very nice to have. But again, that's going to be situationally useful, so you're not going to necessarily be having it up at all stages. Inner Light, if you don't have anything else, just for the additional max Magicka, it's not very useful though, and you won't really be seeing it being used too much. Sanguine Alter or Overflowing Alter is another potential option here. This applies minor lifesteal to everybody within 28 meters as long as you're damaging them. So that's just really, really strong and very, very nice to have. I like Sanguine Alter because you can actually activate that synergy twice because it lasts for 46 seconds. And it is a percentage-based heal, so it's useful for everybody no matter what your health is because it is percentage-based. So I like to have Sanguine Alter out as a healer or as a tank out for fights for that minor lifesteal. Efficient Purge, this is going to be useful for instances where you need to cleanse debuffs, so this is going to be a situationally used ability. So a classic example would be something like the first boss of Halls of Fabrication. You need to clear the poison injection from the spheres that spawn, so that's when you would use Purge. And finally, Stalwart Guard. This is going to be more of an advanced tactic for guilds that are really pushing for score. Basically, you use this on a ranged DPS and give them minor force, which increases their critical damage done by 10%. Now, the downside is you will take 30% of the damage that they take, so this is also mitigated by your own personal mitigation, so it's not going to be a flat 30% from what they're taking. It's going to be reduced by your mitigation, and that's the damage that you take. That is something to keep in mind though. You will end up taking more damage if you're using Stalwart Guard as part of a trade-off for higher DPS for your ranged DPS. And that's pretty much it for your flex skills here. Now for your flex ultimate here, instead of replenishing barrier, you can go something like Magma Shell, which basically gives you 11 seconds of essentially invulnerability. It's not going to be used all that often, but there are going to be instances where it's going to be very, very useful. A good example of when it'd be very nice to have would be something like the 4th boss, the Refabrication Committee in Halls of Fabrication. When you bring them in during execute phase, it might be useful to pop a Magma Shell here in order to keep yourself alive, so that way you can continue to heal people and not necessarily worry about dying yourself, because all your damage is basically going to be limited to 3% of your max health, which you can easily recover by using Healing Springs. So that's one example of where you might want to consider using Magma Shell as your ultimate instead of something like Warhorn instead. So now let's go over our champion points. So so we have have 240 CPs to split across the 3 different nodes here. So starting off with our green CPs, we have 75 into Arcanus and Tenacity, which leaves 90 points, which you can put across the remaining nodes however you'd like. It's all going to be dependent on which specific passives that you want from these specific constellations. So I have 31 to Shadow Ward, 31 to Tumbling, and 20 into Warlord to help conserve my stamina for what I need to block cast or use Break Free very often. For our blue CPs, so if this tune will double as a DPS, you're just going to go with the straight DPS spec. You might want to shift a couple of points into Blessed here, so like 75 points into Blessed or something like that, but it's not absolutely necessary if this is going to be a DPS spec. Otherwise, if you're going to be a pure healer, then go 100 into Blessed, 100 into Elfborn, and then you can put the 40 points really wherever you'd like, because a lot of the nodes in these the blue CPs are going to be focused on DPSing, so they're not going to be very useful for a healer. So for example, I have 27 to Elemental Expert and 13 to Staff Expert, but you can really put 40 points wherever you would like. And for our red CPs, I like to take a one-size-fits-most approach, so I don't have to necessarily change my CPs depending on the content I run. So it's not going to be optimal for every single trial, but it will be good enough for each trial that you won't see necessarily a large difference between optimal CP distributions. So like I said, there are going to be optimal CP distributions for each specific trial depending on the damage you're going to be taking. So a good example would be Hellraw Citadel. You're taking a lot more physical damage compared to magical damage, so you can take points out of Elemental Defender, put them into Ironclad, put them into Hardy in order to get a little bit more resistances to the incoming damage. But for a balanced approach, I have 61 to Ironclad, 51 to Thick Skin, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. Now I do want to mention Bastion and Quick Recovery. You would potentially put 11 points or 31 points into Bastion for these two passive, Heal Physician and Infusion, which is nice to have when you're resurrecting somebody. The thing is though, you are a healer, so you won't necessarily be resurrecting people, you will be instead healing people who will be doing the resurrecting. So a lot of healers will not put any points into this particular tree, because they're not really going to be resurrecting people all too often. But if you want to, there are nice passives to have if you do anticipate yourself potentially resurrecting people further on down the line. Alright, so that is all of our build stuff done and out of the way. So now let's talk about how you should play a Dragonknight healer. So a Dragonknight healer is going to be playing a little bit differently compared to a, for example, Templar healer. So it's really going to revolve around your use of Igneous Shield. So Igneous Shield is going to be your source of major mending, so you get it for 3 seconds after you use it. So if you're doing something like you put out an orb and then you use Igneous Shields, every tick afterwards will be affected by Major Mending. So that's something that you want to keep in mind for your heal over time abilities, that Major Mending will affect each tick while it's up. So it is retroactive in that sense. But usually if you need to do like a burst heal, you'll do something like Igneous Shield and then Combat Prayer to get that additional 25% healing done. So, as a healer, in terms of debuffs, you always want to have Blockade of Storms out for the off-balance. You kind of want to try to maintain off-balance as best you can. The DPS boost from off-balance has been reduced since they introduced a cooldown on off-balance, but it's still something that you want to keep track of because it is still a DPS boost and there is a stronger resource return when enemies are off-balance. So it's really going to be helpful for sustain. The other debuff that you're going to want to keep on the enemy at all times is going to be Minor Magicka Steal and Minor Lifesteal. So in this instance, you're going to want to use Ellie Drain. If you have Sanguine Alter, you're going to want to make sure that's out at all times. If you're using Siphon Spirit, make sure to cast that every 20 seconds. And that's for that additional sustain from Minor Magicka Steal as well as the additional healing from Minor Lifesteal. Minor Lifesteal can in fact proc Spell Power Cure. So that's something to keep in mind. Now in terms of healing, you're going to want to try to keep up your major resistance buffs, so that's going to be your Hardened Armor. And then you're going to want to try to keep up Cauterize as well for the additional burst heal. So Hardened Armor lasts for 20 seconds, Cauterize lasts for 15, so you're going to want to re-up those. Your primary source of healing is going to be coming from Combat Prayer and Healing Springs though. So like I said earlier, if you need to do a stronger heal, do Igneous Shield first and then Combat Prayer. That just gives the extra 25% additional healing. Now, every 6 seconds you will get additional ultimate back when you use Igneous Shield, so you're going to want to try to use it every 6 seconds if you can for the maximum ultimate gain, but it's not a big deal if you can't hit that 6 seconds. Pretty much whenever your Igneous Shield drops, if it's not consumed by damage, is when you're going to want to re-up it for the additional ultimate gain there. Now if you are using the Asylum's Resto staff after you use Comet Prayer, you can use something like Orbs, so that's a very expensive heal, so it's affected by that Asylum staff proc. If you're using the Master's Restoration staff, just Healing Springs will just give stamina back on that first tick, so you can just spam springs to give your stamina DPS and tank additional stamina. And then obviously, when you need to shield, put up your shield on your front bar here, block, do whatever you need to in order to mitigate damage, because staying alive is very, very important. So that's pretty much how you play the Dragonknight healer. It revolves very much around using Igneous Shield in order to make your heal stronger. So you don't want to cast it every 3 seconds because it is fairly expensive and it is not affected by your Asylum staff proc. So it's not affected because it's not considered a healing ability. So you want to use it every 6 seconds if you can for the ultimate gen. That would be the ideal scenario. Every 6 seconds you use Igneous Shields. But it is a fairly expensive ability, so you're not necessarily going to be able to do it every 6 seconds. Definitely use Igneous Shield whenever you need to do a large burst heal. So do Igneous and then Comet Prayer because you don't have something like Breath of Life. And Comet Prayer is going to be your strongest burst heal. You do need to be within 18 meters in order for Comet Prayer to hit, so just keep that in mind. So that's it for this video. It's very difficult to explain how to use a Dragonknight healer without actually healing content. Unfortunately, I do not have a Dragonknight healer on live right now. I can respec my tank to be a healer if I want to though, and I might do that just for a vet trial run so you guys can see how I heal on him I should say. So this is it. This is on the PTS. Just play around with healing and just kind of figure things out. Like I said, it's revolving a lot around using Igneous Shield for the ulti gen and the major mending buff, and then try to keep up Cauterizer for that burst heal, and keep your debuffs up, keep your buffs up. Comet Prayer and Healing Springs are your primary healing sources. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.